The massacre in Las Vegas has once again put the long-simmering debate over gun control back on boil. The shooter had 23 firearms in his hotel room, including, according to the Washington Post, at least a dozen semi-automatic rifles legally modified to fire like automatic weapons. The debate follows a well-worn and familiar path. Liberals cry out for more gun control, and members of the NRA-tethered Republican Party decry the politicization of tragedy, as if the question of how someone gets their hands on a dozen essentially automatic rifles isn't inherently a political one. But what this debate obscures is that we already have a form of gun control in the United States. The problem is that it's a form of gun control that does little to nothing to keep us safe, and that mostly results in locking up huge numbers of poor black men. This, to be clear, is not an argument against gun control. I'm not a fan at all of either the case made by the NRA on the right or the case made by some on the radical left that says we need firearms to resist the government. Rather, my point is that we currently have a two-tiered right to bear arms in this country that has led the right to bear any and every arm being sacrosanct for white Americans, while being relentlessly criminalized for many black Americans. I firmly believe that we must disarm all of American society, including, ultimately, the police. What the current setup does is it permits the mass production and distribution of guns into a segregated two-tier system of gun rights. The result is that we have horrible shootings, whether on the south side of Chicago or from the broken window of a Las Vegas hotel, alongside mass incarceration of black men for carrying guns, the mere possession of guns. In short, our gun control status quo is the worst setup imaginable. Reporters, unfortunately, almost never talk about this, and I find it incredibly frustrating, as you can probably tell. For many journalists, it's always a question of there being just two positions on guns or really on anything. One a liberal position and the other a conservative position. As a result, a real left position is often rendered invisible. That's why so many political reporters, for example, had such a hard time making sense of Bernie Sanders initially. When it comes to guns, I think the left should say this: we want a society without readily available weapons of war on the streets and a society without mass incarceration. It seems reasonable enough to me. Not that it'll be easy to make this happen, either of them, but it seems like a reasonable enough vision and statement of principles to me. Anyhow, my guest for this episode is Ben Levin, a professor of law at the University of Colorado Law School, who teaches and writes about criminal law and procedure. Before entering academia, he practiced civil rights law, focusing on police and prosecutorial misconduct, and served as a law clerk to 2 federal judges. More to the point, his 2016 article, Guns and Drugs, in the Fordham Law Review, really helped shape my thinking on guns and mass incarceration. Ben Levin, welcome to The Dig.
Thanks, Ben. Pleasure to be here.
The case that you make in your article from last year, Guns and Drugs, and that you started to lay out there is that a lot of the same problems that critics point out about the war on drugs map pretty well on to the war on guns, but the debate is very different. In fact, the way the entire debate is structured as just kind of NRA libertarian right versus liberal pro-gun control really seems to obscure how the policing and prosecution of guns has created this sort of two-tiered right to bear arms in this country, and as a result become really one of the key components, among many, of the carceral state.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's interesting and that actually concerns me is I think in some ways there's a dangerous preoccupation with the Second Amendment in these conversations, right? So it makes sense that maybe from a gun rights perspective or an anti-gun control perspective, the Second Amendment and the language of the Second Amendment are very important and very helpful. And certainly given what the Supreme Court did in Heller and in McDonald, the two big cases where the court defined the Second Amendment as guaranteeing an individual right to bear arms. Those are, that becomes very important to folks who care deeply about their right to have guns. I think from a gun control perspective, and for liberals, for folks on the left, for folks on the right who may be kind of more skeptical to some of those positions, I think one of the problems is that the concern or the frame is in terms of simply a right to bear arms or a lack of such a right to bear arms, right? So it's all about the Second Amendment. And so for folks who either don't want guns, who don't think other people should have guns, it's not that difficult to make an argument that says that's something like the Second Amendment should mean something else, or maybe we should pass a constitutional amendment, or we should come up with statutes that in some way won't fall afoul of the Second Amendment, but will prevent people from owning guns. What I worry about, it's a point that I make in the article, and I think it's something that in talking to many folks involved in criminal practice, it's something you see is that there are a range of other rights, of other liberties, of other interests that are implicated by these statutes. Right. So I think maybe the best example is to think about the stop and frisk policy in New York City, where the NYPD was effectively stopping and frisking large numbers, usually of young Black men, although kind of a range of people, but predominantly young Black men. And the idea was there had been issues with gun violence, and there was a concern about getting guns off the street. So again, framed simply in terms of pro-gun, anti-gun, this is a measure designed to root out guns, but it implicates so many other interests, right? For generations, or at least a couple of generations of people in New York, this meant that kind of being a person of color in New York, being someone of a certain race or age or looking a certain way, meant that you were going to be subjected to kind of constant surveillance or police intrusion. Right?
And this came in for a huge amount of criticism from the center left onward left, yet I think people didn't really process that mass stop and frisk by the NYPD was premised on searching for guns. Even though it turned up a lot more small amounts of marijuana, the premise and justification was always searching for guns. Yet even with all the criticism of the program that ultimately resulted in a federal judge ruling that it was unconstitutional, even then the mainstream critics of stop and frisk didn't really seem to grasp how Bloomberg in particular's anti-gun gun control agenda was expressed most of all through stop and frisk.
Right. No, I think that it's a really important point that I think that the aspect gets forgotten. And, I think kind of in popular discourse, it was framed in terms of the war on drugs. It was sort of folded into that conversation. And, I think one of the really important lessons from a lot of this, I think not just about guns, but about the way kind of as a society, we use the criminal justice system or that kind of the government uses criminal law, is to think about these situations where criticism becomes very common, right? And take the war on drugs, take stop and frisk. And I think a danger is to frame it in sort of the least offensive terms, right? It's to say, the war on drugs is a problem because marijuana is not really that bad, so we should decriminalize marijuana. Now, regardless of your feelings on marijuana or whether it should be decriminalized,
this show is decidedly pro marijuana, just as a caveat.
Right. Okay. Okay. So we're in marijuana friendly territory here, but right, like it's sort of an ahistorical claim to make the war on drugs simply about marijuana, and a critique of the war on drugs that isn't able to reckon with crack, with heroin. And again, this is, I think, a huge issue as we now talk about the regulation and the criminal regulation of opioids, right?
Yes.
Is that an opiate is the idea that the minute we start talking about something that people actually do perceive as scary, as risky, as dangerous, a lot of these critiques start to evaporate. And that's a problem if those critiques are really serious, right? If we really are concerned about the number of people being put onto prison, if we're really concerned about intrusive policing, if we're really concerned about racial disparities, those need to be concerns when we talk about scary stuff as well. Not just when we sort of defanged the social problem, right? Not just when we're talking about low, small amount possession of marijuana.
Yeah, there's this. I think one thing you're hitting on by pointing out the reluctance to apply the straightforward critique of the war on drugs to the war on guns. There are all these other problems or kind of liberal hesitancies that sort of echoes. It's the failure to apply the critique of the war on marijuana to the broader war on drugs, which really must entail an evaluation and criticism of the entire prohibitionist regime from the get-go. And if we're going to deal with mass incarceration, we have to move past this idea that prisons are just full of people who were unlucky enough or to get locked up for possessing small amounts of marijuana. I mean, frankly, that's just not who's in prison and why we have mass incarceration. We have to think of these broader regimes that criminalize such broad swaths of American life and that impose such severe sentences.
Right, and I think it's such an important point, and I know I guess James Foreman, who I believe has been a guest on your show, has written this really powerful book, Locking Up Our Own, and one of kind of his critical interventions is he looks at what happened in Washington D.C. in a majority black city that actually had kind of it wasn't just a story of sort of some of kind of a more conservative, white, tough on crime population imposing its will. It was really the reality of people trying to grapple with, and again, in that context, with heroin addiction, with crime, with a lot of things that are more difficult. And so I think, to me, it was one of the things that I was really drawn to this question of guns in terms of is the fact that if we're really serious about those critiques and if we want to do something about the system, it does us no good to pretend that those problems aren't out there, which is why I think it is important to have these conversations, in the wake of the shootings in Las Vegas, in the wake of these really horrible events that. There's always the conversation about, can they be politicized or not politicized? And, of course, this is when we should have these conversations. I think the really important point, though, and the thing that we need to grapple with in all of this is sort of what are the trade-offs? And it's not just a question of doing something or doing nothing. It's, what is that something? And it's something that, Foreman and others have recounted. We look back kind of at a number of crime spikes, at a number of moments where there was a lot of attention played to drug addiction and other things, is that too often that do something response was carceral.